Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 5 for PPA 500. Hard to believe, but we only have officially 10 days left in our class together. We have next Wednesday evening in Zoom, and then we have Saturday on the 21st if we need that session. But again, we'll play it by ear and see how we are doing. As you can tell, I am connected tonight, so far, so good. I don't have a whole lot of confidence in the stability of the internet right now. Apparently, that there are all kinds of outages, and even though this service has been restored, I understand that there could be some intermittent issues. And so, if you lose me and I drop out, it's just because I'm having issues with the internet, and I'll get back in as soon as I can. What I am going to do though is turn off my camera because that oftentimes saves a lot of bandwidth, especially when there are some issues. So, no offense, but I'm going to try and keep my camera off just to save a little bit on bandwidth. So, if for some reason things go haywire and I'm no longer able to connect, I'll contact everyone with an email and let you know. We'll pick up wherever we left off with a video, and I'll put together a video and put it up on our Canvas site. But hopefully that won't be necessary, and I'm hoping the connection stays as stable as possible. So, for those of you who've already turned in your midterm assessment, thank you for that. If you haven't turned it in yet, it is due by midnight tonight. All those midterm assessments that have come in since up to probably about 5:30 or so, I've been able to take a look at those and grade those and provide you feedback. So far, very good on the midterm assessments. I think everyone's doing really well. All the grades are in the A and the very, very, very high B range. So I'm really happy with the answers that you're providing on the midterm. So very nice work there, but please do make sure to get that turned in tonight if you have not turned it in yet, and I'll get that turned around and back to you as quickly as possible. Then our assignments that are coming up next Wednesday, you have your fifth and final Canvas essay. That final Canvas essay will draw upon information we talked about tonight in terms of the policy process, and we'll ask you to specifically select one public policy area that you are interested in, one public policy, and then for that public policy, discuss what you think the primary decision-making model was that was used in developing that policy. Tonight, we will cover 4 different decision-making models: rational, comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can model decision-making. So you'll be picking whichever of those models you think best represent the development of that policy. And then if you think there's another decision-making model that might have worked better, to then go ahead and share that decision-making model as part of your post. So that's Canvas essay number 5, which is due next Wednesday. And then the final assignment you have is fittingly the final assessment. And that is due then by midnight next Saturday, February the 21st. So I have shared that on our Canvas site. Hopefully you have access to it. But what I'd like to do is the same thing we did with the midterm, is that we will talk about the final, and just I'll walk you through the final and let you show you kind of what the scenarios are. The approach is the same thing that we had for the midterm. You've got 5 scenarios, 2 questions related to each scenario, and I'll walk you through those scenarios. The expectations are the same. Paragraph or 2 for your answers will certainly be enough to suffice. So let's go ahead to take a look at these scenarios. So let's start out with scenario number 1. So if you've looked at the final assessment, you're aware of the fact that it is not cumulative, so it only covers the information from the end of the midterm. So the first scenario looks at the idea of career civil service and public employment. That is information that, if time permits, we will start talking about that information tonight, and then we'll finish that information then next week. So, you applied for a position with the United States Department of Veterans Affairs as a policy analyst in January. In March, you received notice that you've advanced to the next round of selection and will be scheduled for an interview in early April. Finally, in late April, you are contacted again, and an interview occurs on May 15th. During the interview, you are told that the process is ongoing and you will be informed of the next steps within the next 6 weeks. In early June, your friend referred you to a job with a private sector marketing firm. You apply, are interviewed, and hired on the spot. You accept the position with the private firm and lament the lost opportunity with the Department of Veterans Affairs. In early July, the department contacts you with a job offer that you must politely decline. So your initial goal was to get a job with Veterans Affairs. You applied for that job way back in January. It didn't get offered to you until early July, and in the interim, you had to take another job in the private sector. So, question 1A, why did it take so long for the hiring process to occur in the federal government? What are some of the differences in working for public and private sectors? And then 1B, the evolution of hiring in the federal government has trended toward hiring people based upon knowledge, skills, and abilities, as opposed to which political party they support. Please discuss the three main eras of public employment and the evolution of hiring from the late 1700s until today. What era of employment are we currently in? So those are the two questions you'll be answering that, again, look at the idea of career civil service and look at how we hire public administrators to work in the public bureaucracy. So that's number one. Scenario number two, the maintenance department of the Department of Public Works maintains all public facilities within the city of Treetown. Treetown is a well-maintained community and prides itself on the cleanliness of its public facilities. However, as the city has grown over the past several years, the number of public facilities has as well. This has resulted in maintenance workers being asked to do more and often to complete work outside of their position descriptions. As a result, the maintenance workers bargaining unit files a grievance that the additional new work has changed the work conditions of maintenance employees. This grievance eventually makes its way into the collective bargaining negotiations, and management and the bargaining unit have been struggling to come to an agreement over the issue. The bargaining unit declares an impasse when it's apparent that no agreement is on the horizon. So in question 2A, what impasse resolution processes are available to the bargaining unit and the agency? Please discuss the three primary impasse resolution options that we will present probably at the end of class tonight if we have time. If not, then at the beginning of class next week. If you were a new director for this agency and had to direct your human resources manager to correct the issues of employees working outside their descriptions, what functions of human resource management should your human resources manager do? This looks at the primary functions of human resource management, how we manage human resources as an essential function of public administration. This is information that we will cover in the first half of class next week. Scenario number 3. The city of Preble Heights is struggling with its budget. And this is a fictional city of Preble Heights. There's actually a real city of Preble Heights. This is not the real city. This is a fictional one. And Preble Heights is struggling with its budget.
No, no sé, una vez la tenía.
So is there a question? Okay. We'll keep on going. So we've got Preble Heights struggling with its budget. It uses a simple line item budget and typically increases expenditures each year in connection with increases in GDP rates, gross domestic product. Over the past 5 years, the city failed to complete its budget on time and struggled to balance revenues and expenditures. The city auditor found that many programs are inefficient and are not achieving their goals and objectives. Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and those are two of the primary credit rating agencies that will provide bond ratings to municipalities. They have both reduced the city's credit rating due to its budget issues. As a city council member, you and your colleagues need to recommend a new budgeting format to try and alleviate these concerns. 3A, select and recommend a new budget format for the city that will address the concerns in this scenario. We will cover this in the second half of class next week. I'll present to you several different, at least 4 different budget formats: line item, performance-based, program-based, zero-based. We'll talk about how they work and their advantages and their disadvantages. Then based upon that discussion, you'll be selecting which budget format you think would be appropriate to apply to the city in order to deal with all these concerns that were listed in the scenario. Then in 3B, the city's aquatic center needs renovation. Given the city's fiscal problems, it is clear that the city lacks the resources to complete the project without borrowing money. The Aquatic Center is open to citizens for lap swimming Monday through Saturday from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Citizens pay a $3 fee to use the facility, and 100 residents use the facility for lap swimming 200 days out of the year. The city also charges a $20,000 per year fee to the school district and club teams to use the facility for practices. A total of 6 teams pay this fee. The operating expenses for the aquatic center amount to $180,000 per year. Since the city does not have the money to pay for renovations, it proposes a bond to cover the costs. Which type of bond would you recommend and why? Again, the second half of class next week, we'll talk about borrowing money in the public sector. We'll talk about issuing long-term bonds. I'll share with you some of the primary types of bonds that governments use in order to borrow money, things such as general obligation bonds, special revenue bonds, double barrel bonds, and we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each. And here you'll be selecting one of those types of bonds to recommend and tell me why it is most appropriate in this scenario. So all that information you'll need for scenario number 5, you'll get in the second half of class next week. Number 4, the city of Preble Heights, so we're sticking with Preble Heights, also has a unit known as the Economic Revitalization Department, otherwise known as ERD. ERD's primary task is to implement a policy known as the Urban Revitalization Initiative. The initiative provides cash grants to businesses who renovate their facilities and remain in urban areas as opposed to moving to other states. The primary beneficiaries of these grants are obviously business owners who are willing to stay where they are and continue to contribute to economic growth in urban areas of the city, which would be primarily downtown. To be successful, the policy would need to provide enough grant money to offset the cost savings of potentially moving to other states and areas. Not all members of ERD are in favor of the policy goals and believe that it's not the role of government to influence business decisions. These employees have sometimes been accused of slow walking grant applications to delay the payment of money to applicants. Question 4A from a policy implementation perspective. Utilize Pressman and Waldowski's implementation research to illustrate some of the barriers to successfully implementing this policy. This is information we will talk about as soon as we're done here with talking about the final. We'll talk about in the first half of class tonight. Then in 4B, drawing upon the 4 models of organizational effectiveness, examine this scenario from the perspective of each of those models. How would each model define the agency's effectiveness in implementing this policy? Again, tonight we will talk about the different models of effectiveness that can be applied to organizations, policies, and programs. I'll present to you 4 different models of how we can define and measure effectiveness. So here you will be examining the scenario from the perspective of those 4 different models and tell me how each model would define effectiveness in implementing the policy. Each of those 4 models has a slightly different way of defining what they consider to be effectiveness. So the information for scenario 4 you will get in class tonight. Then scenario number 5, this is our program evaluation scenario. So again, this is information that we'll cover in class tonight. It has now been 2 years since Preble Heights renovated its recreation center. The Parks and Recreation Commissioner, Julia Lopez, approached the council last year with a proposal to address juvenile delinquency in the city. The city has seen a rise in the incidence of graffiti and vandalism over the past several years. Ms. Lopez proposed creating a program of after-school sports offered free of charge at the recreation center. The after-school sports programs offered from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday and 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Saturdays. The goal of the program is to give youth something to do after school and deter them from engaging in acts of graffiti and vandalism. The program's been up and running for 1 year. You are a program specialist, and the city manager has approached you to create a program evaluation to evaluate the effectiveness of this after-school sports program. Question 5A, identify and discuss the primary independent variable, dependent variable, and control variables that you would use in a program evaluation of this after-school sports program. Then in 5B, identify and discuss the research or evaluation design that you would recommend using to evaluate the program's effectiveness. This is information we'll talk about tonight when we talk about the role of public administrators in the evaluation of public programs. So that, excuse me, in a nutshell, is the final assessment. Again, same ground rules apply to the final as apply to the midterm, and you have until midnight on this December on February 21st, so a week from Saturday to submit the final. Just like you do at the midterm, you can go ahead and just insert your answers directly into this document and then upload it to the Canvas site. So, any questions on the final assessment? Okay. And just like with the midterm assessment, this is truly an assessment, so it doesn't require any outside research. You'll just be using the information that you have obtained and learned in your time in the class. The question about what sorts of questions can we answer now before the final assessment? You can start working on the final assessment after as soon as we're done tonight, if you would like. The scenario number four, scenario number five, you have all the information you need to handle those scenarios as soon as we're done with class tonight. You'll have some of the information that you need for scenario one. But the budgeting scenario, that's something you're going to have to wait until next week because we will not get into budgeting and finance tonight. But you can certainly start working on scenarios four and five right away. Let me now share out our slides for the evening. I've got two different sets of slides because I'm assuming we'll probably have time to move on into a discussion of public employment and the career civil service system. So I have a separate set of slides for that. But as you know, last week we've talked a lot about the role of public administrators in terms of organizations. And so we kind of presented to you this idea of leading and managing organizations and the theoretical perspectives that the discipline has developed in how we study and learn about public organizations. And so that was your lead in to the PPA 660 organization theory class that you'll be taking in several months. And that's what I'd like to do with this class is kind of give you this insight into each of your future core courses. So 660 was with organization theory. Tonight, we're going to foreshadow the work you're going to be doing in PPA 670 public policy analysis, as well as PPA 696 research methods. And as you know, the research methods course, even though it's called research methods, it really is program evaluation. So we take these classic social science research methods and we put them into the service of evaluating public programs. So tonight will be your lead in to 670 as well as 696. And what we're going to be looking at here, especially with public policies, we're going to be looking at how public policies are developed, how they are implemented, some of the barriers and obstacles that can prevent effective implementation of public policies, how we then evaluate these policies for effectiveness. Those are kind of the topics that your 670 class kind of revolves around, and we'll be talking about briefly here tonight. And then obviously the role of public administrators in terms of formulating, implementing, and evaluating public policies. So we're going to talk about public policies, and after that, we'll turn our attention to public programs. But it is important at the outset to kind of distinguish between what we consider to be a policy versus what we consider to be a public program. And admittedly, there are some MPA programs, accredited MPA programs across the world, that combine the two topics together. And so they'll have one core course in public policy and program analysis or evaluation. We in our program divide them into two separate core courses because when you compare policies to programs, policies tend to be more general in nature. Programs tend to be more specific. And so a program, a public program, will be developed for the purpose of supporting the overall goals of a public policy. So public policies tend to be more general. They tend to be a little bit more difficult to measure in terms of their outcomes as compared to public programs. So, since policies tend to be more general than public programs, we also evaluate and analyze those policies using somewhat different tools and approaches than how we will evaluate public programs. So, if you want to think about it in kind of this analogy of a bridge. So a public program is a bridge. So it's the overarching policy, it's the overarching goals and objectives. And then that bridge is supported by these pillars. And those pillars are then your public programs. So the pillars support the bridge. The programs support the public policy. So you may have a policy such as, in the education world, educating at-risk youth. So your goal is to enhance the educational achievement levels of at-risk youth, the relatively general policy and general policy goal. But then you'll implement multiple specific public programs to help support your overall goal of enhancing the educational attainment levels of at-risk youth. So you may have a public program that could be a program that provides after-school tutoring. That's a specific program that supports the overarching policy goal. You may have a counseling program that again helps to support that overall overarching policy goal. Those public programs tend to have more quantifiable indicators to measure their effectiveness as opposed to the overall public policies. So, in general, public policies are more general in nature, public programs are more specific. What we're going to start out talking about tonight are public policies. And when you take your 670 policy analysis class, or if you've had public policy at the undergraduate level, you are familiar with the idea that there are multiple phases in the policy process. And we've talked about this in previous class sessions. And so the first phase of the policy process is obviously formulation. Formation and formulation, I use those two terms interchangeably. This is where a policy comes to life. So this is where we're actually designing that policy. But we also know from our discussion of power in John Gaventa's typology that in order to have a policy, an issue has to first get onto the decision-making agenda of a policy-making body. As we talked about with John Gaventa, through mobilization of bias, coal mine owners were able to keep mine safety legislation off of the formal agenda of state legislatures. Since it never got on the formal agenda of state legislatures, there was never any legislation passed, any policies passed to dictate coal mine safety. So the first step is what we call agenda setting. Now, sometimes when people teach public policy, they will separate out agenda setting from formulation. I kind of include agenda setting within the formulation process. So one of the primary theorists who helps us understand agenda setting is John Kingdon. And as you probably know from the reading, John Kingdon presents us with his model of how issues make it onto the formal decision-making agenda. For John Kingdon, there's kind of what he would refer to as a primordial soup out there of all these different issues, all these different problems. They're kind of floating around out in that primordial soup. People are somewhat aware of them, but they haven't really made it to the level of getting onto a formal decision-making agenda. So what he was interested in is finding out why some issues make it onto the formal agenda while some other issues languish in this primordial soup and never make it onto the agenda. Kingdon made this argument of his policy stream convergence that you see the little diagram at the bottom of the screen there. In his policy stream convergence, decisions about policies get onto the decision-making agenda through the convergence of these different streams. And so we have a problem stream. So we've got a stream out there of these problems. We also have what he called a proposal stream, which is kind of the solutions to how we're going to address and fix those problems. And then the third stream is the stream of politics. Politics will always be important in policy making. Politics provide that impetus for elected officials to become very concerned about these issues and really want to do something about them. As we know, they're mostly guided and mostly directed by their desire for re-election. So politics will play a very important role. So you've got a problems, the proposals, and a politics stream. When those streams all flow together, according to John Kingdon, it then opens what he calls a policy window. And in order for an issue to get on the agenda and to then have a policy made to deal with it, that policy window must open up. But that policy window to get something on the agenda only really opens up when problems and a proposal and politics all flow together to open up that window. So I think you can probably make an argument with Kingdon that you had a policy window that opened up after September 11th. So after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, we had an idea what the problem was. And the problem was that we were not screening passengers adequately to screen out those terrorist threats. So we had a problem there. Proposal was to enhance the screening. And so by creating a Department of Homeland Security and creating a TSA, we would then have hopefully a solution to try and address that problem. The politics were certainly very clear in that the public and elected officials wanted to do something, and they want to do something very bold in response to the worst terrorist attack the nation had ever seen. So all those things flowed together, opened up that policy window, and we get this major change to how we deal with Homeland Security, with again the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and TSA and all these airport screening procedures. I think it's a pretty good illustration of Kingdon's policy stream convergence model for how issues make it onto the decision-making agenda. But they must first get on that agenda before we can make decisions about how we are going to address those policy issues and those problems. So there needs to be some type of decision-making calculus that we use in the policy formulation process. And so I would offer up to you tonight four different decision-making models. And some of these you've probably seen before, some you may not have seen before, that can help explain why we make the decisions we make in creating and formulating these types of policies. And those four different decision-making models are rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and the garbage can model of decision making, which happens to be my personal favorite. And it kind of tracks pretty closely with Kingdon's policy stream convergence model as well. So let's start with rational comprehensive. I think we all have a good sense of what rational comprehensive decision making is what Charles Lindblom referred to as the root approach. So we get to the very root of the problem, or at least we try to get to the root of the problem. So the way in which we get to the root of the problem in rational comprehensive is we clearly identify and define what we are trying to achieve with this public policy. So we have a clear idea of what our policy goals are. We then go out there and based upon those goals we're trying to achieve, we collect all of the information, all the available information that is out there. So it's a comprehensive, complete process of collecting all the possible information. We then, after we collect all that information, we then use that information to construct a series of different solutions or proposals, as Kingdon would call them. And these are essentially the means toward the end, the ways in which we are going to achieve our policy goals. So we identify all the different possible ways in which we can achieve this goal using all the possible information. What we're doing when we identify all these different ways for achieving our goals is we are essentially generating a full and complete range of alternatives. So these are all the alternative solutions that are out there that we could then select from in order to apply to solve our problem. So it's a full range of alternatives. Since our range of alternatives, our range of solutions is complete and comprehensive, we then have the ability to select the singular best alternative. And then when we select that best alternative, that then becomes the focus of our public policy. And then we design how we are going to implement that best alternative. And that is then the public policy. So it's an approach where we collect all and use all the information possible in order to make our decisions. So obviously, that's kind of the ideal. It would be great if we had the time and the resources, the energy to be able to collect all of this information and put together this entire full range of policy alternatives. As we know, we do not have a lot of time. We don't have all the cognitive abilities in the world. So oftentimes this is not something that is possible. Yeah, in terms of the difference between three and four, in three, we're using the information to put together the solutions. And then in four, once we put all those solutions together in this full range, we can then compare all the solutions with each other. And so once you put your solutions together into this full range, you then have to compare them with each other and then select the best one. So it's kind of, one step comes after the other. So you identify them, you put them into this full range of alternatives so you can compare them with each other, all their advantages versus all their disadvantages. But as Herbert Simon tells us, we are human beings. We're human beings formulating these policies. And as human beings, we have inherent cognitive limitations. There's only so much information that we as human beings can access. There's only so much information that we as human beings can understand. And those types of cognitive limitations leads to what Herb Simon refers to as a process of bounded rationality. That as human beings, we have rationality boundaries, boundaries to just how rational we can be. So Simon would criticize the rational comprehensive approach and saying it's just not practical because we don't have the time, the cognitive ability in order to be able to do this. Also, you think about our limitations in terms of cognitive limitations within the idea of externalities. And externalities are these unintended consequences that if we take one action, it's going to lead to these other consequences. Now, sometimes we're not able to forecast what those externalities are. We don't know what all those unintended consequences are. So that then makes it impossible for us to take all those consequences into account. In the policy process, in the policy world, there is a term that's known as a wicked policy problem. And a wicked policy problem is a problem that when you try and solve that problem, you are then creating a multitude of other problems in other areas. And so it's not as simple as just saying, well, this will solve this problem. You got to think of all of the other problems you're going to create in solving that problem. Those are those externalities. Those are those unintended consequences. So even though rational comprehensive sounds good on paper, we realize that it's much more difficult for us to implement daily in a practical way in formulating our policies. And so an alternative to rational comprehensive is our good friend incrementalism. Charles Lindblom, who received a whole lot of acclaim for his work, I'll put him in text chat because he kind of has an unusual spelling to his name, Charles Lindblom. Lindblom made the argument that because rational comprehensive was kind of a pie in the sky type of ideal, and we have all these limitations we have to struggle with in the public sector, we typically don't use rational comprehensive decision making on a very frequent basis in public organizations. Instead, what Lindblom argued is he said, we instead use this approach known as incrementalism. And in his article called The Science of Muddling Through, Lindblom just kind of described this is what really goes on a daily basis. It's more incremental than it is rational. Whereas rational was the root approach. We get to the root of the problem by being rational and comprehensive. Incrementalism is what Lindblom refers to as the branch approach. So we can never really get to the root of the tree. So instead, we are dealing at the branches. And so we trim that tree by the branches rather than cutting that tree down by the root. So incrementalism, according to Charles Lindblom, is that we don't have the ability in step one to clearly identify and define all of our goals. So our goals are sometimes unclear. Sometimes the means for achieving the goals can be intertwined with the goals themselves. And so one person may say, this is a policy goal. Another person may say, no, this is just a step toward achieving another goal. So it's hard to get clear agreement on exactly what our policy goals are. Under rational comprehensive in step one, we had that agreement. Here in incrementalism, we oftentimes don't have that agreement. In step two, when we go out there to collect our information, we are not able to collect all the information because of our bounded rationality, our time and resource limitations. We will go out there and collect as much information as we possibly can. If you're only collecting as much information as you possibly can, you are not able to generate a full range of alternative solutions. It's just impossible. So instead, what you're putting together is a limited range of alternative solutions. Once you are putting together a limited range of alternative solutions, you can no longer say that you are selecting the best alternative because the best alternative solution may be something we never even thought of. It never even occurred to us because we don't have the cognitive abilities to think of it. So, what we do instead is with this limited range of alternatives, we will do what's called limited successive comparisons. So, we'll take alternative solution A and we'll compare its advantages and disadvantages to solution B, and then compare B to C, and then C to D, and then A to D, and then B to D. Those are limited successive comparisons. So we compare them to each other in those limited types of ways. Since we have this limited range of alternatives, we're not going to be able to select the best alternative. So typically, we select the alternative solution that is the first appropriate solution that works for us now. So we look for the first appropriate solution that will work now, and that then becomes the basis for our public policy. So instead of looking for the best as we do in rationality, we're looking for the first most appropriate alternative in incrementalism. Now, Charles Lindblom, again, in his Science of Muddling Through, learned a lot of acclaim, got a lot of awards and accolades for his writing. He was shocked by the amount of acclaim he got because he said, I wasn't really developing a new theory. I was just describing how things actually work in the real world of public administration. And he said, I was just saying this is the way it actually works in the real world. So he was really surprised. He thought it was just a description of how decision making was being done, as opposed to coming up with a brand new theory. But what incrementalism does is it gives us this alternative to rational and comprehensive decision making. The advantages of incrementalism is obviously incrementalism is much more realistic. It's something that can be done within our bounded rationality, within our limitation of resources. The problem with incrementalism is that we are never really going back and rethinking how we are doing things. Essentially, what we're going to do is we're just going to build off of what we are already doing. So think about the world of budgeting. Whenever we put a budget together, if you deal with putting a budget together in your agency, you know that through incrementalism, we look at how much money we spent last year and what we spent money on, and then we'll make a slight adjustment to it for the next fiscal year. So we may add on 2 or 3% to keep up with a cost of living factor, but that's all the only change we're going to make. We're never going to really go back and reevaluate and reassess should we be spending money on this source of spending on this expenditure to even begin with. So we do a lot of this in budgeting. The good thing about that is you don't make huge mistakes because you're never going back and completely reevaluating what you are doing and coming up with a brand new approach. The problem with it is if what you are doing and the money you are spending on expenditure, if that is not accomplishing your goals, then you're going to continue making those small mistakes year after year after year. Next week, when we talk about different budget formats, we are going to talk about a budget format such as line item budgeting, by far the most common type of budget format used at the local level of government. Line item budgets are very much predicated upon this idea of incrementalism. The only information you get in a line item budget is how much money you spent last year and the expenditures that you spent that money on. Those line items, those objects of expenditure. That's all the information you have to go on. So you just simply, most of the time, will take the amount that you spent last year and just add on a percentage. That's incrementalism in practice. So Lindblom would make the argument that incrementalism is oftentimes far more common in public organizations than purely being rational comprehensive. Robert said, with incremental, it seems like there would be a need to make adjustments as needed along the way, and for that to be acceptable, and that's where you do make those small adjustments. So oftentimes those adjustments are relatively small, especially in the world of budgeting. If you're going to use a line on a budget, the only information you have is the information that leads you to be incremental. However, if you use another more rational type of budget format, like we'll talk about next week, something like zero-based budgeting or program budgeting, that allows you in that more rational way to go back and ask that fundamental question, should we be funding this policy or these programs to begin with? And that's where you get your really big changes and your really big adjustments. The adjustments that you make in incrementalism are much smaller than what you would be doing in a rational, comprehensive type of an approach. So this is incrementalism. This is what Lindblom says usually happens in our public organizations, and really felt that was the way in which we made decisions, including in the policy formulation process. So you kind of build off what you have done before. A lot of our current policies at the federal level are built upon how they were done in the past. And so usually when we do pass these appropriations for these policies, we're usually basing what we're doing next fiscal year on what we did last fiscal year. Now, there are some exceptions to that. And, again, September 11th was a good example of a major change when that policy window opened and allowed for a major change. That was a much more rational approach to designing that new policy. I think it's also important to note that when you're talking from a practical perspective about how we make decisions in the public sector, talking about rational, comprehensive, and incrementalism as a dichotomy can sometimes get us into a little bit of trouble. In that I think there are gradations in between. And so there are certain times with certain policies where we have some glimmers of rationality. So we're a little bit more rational this year than the way in which we approached the policy or the problem in the past. So I think there are some gradations there where you're a little bit more rational, a little bit less rational. I don't think it's just that dichotomy of you're either rational or you're incremental. So I do think the waters are a little bit more muddied than just that binary dichotomous type of definition. But because we have rational comprehensive over here and we have incrementalism over here, kind of at different polar opposites of themselves, there must be something in the middle. And what is in the middle is a third decision-making model known as mixed scanning. And that is something that comes to us from a theorist by the name of Amitai Etzioni. It's one of my favorite names of a theorist, Amitai Etzioni. My other favorite name of a theorist is a budgeting author who we'll talk about in the intergovernmental relations class, and his name is Philip Moneypenny. Moneypenny is probably the best name ever for anybody who does any writing in public budgeting. But Amitai Etzioni is still a great name. And Amitai Etzioni, in his theory of mixed scanning, tells us we can combine rationality and incrementalism. And the way in which he advocates that we combine them is for very large, important, momentous issues and problems, we should try and be as rational as we can possibly be. However, for those smaller, more mundane issues, we can go ahead and get away with being incremental. So big issues, rationality, smaller issues, incrementalism. And again, to go back and look at the budgeting process, I think we see this play out pretty prominently in how we do budgets, especially at the state and local level. So for our operating budgets that will fund our operations from one year to the next, most of those things we are spending money on are relatively static. You're going to be spending money on salary, you're going to be spending money on benefits, you're going to be spending money on maintenance and on utilities. Yes, those will go up from year to year, but the baseline of that will be relatively stable. And so for our operating budgets, we oftentimes use line item budgeting and we oftentimes adhere to incremental decision making. However, when we are faced with a very big decision, such as should we build an $80 million recreation center? Should we build a $100 million event center? Those are very big, high price tag items. And so for those items, we tend to be much more rational. That's why we put together capital improvement plans. We put together these CIPs. That's why we oftentimes segregate that facility spending in a capital budget as opposed to lumping it in with our operating budget. So for those types of facility decisions, we oftentimes tend to be much more rational. For our operating budget decisions, we tend to be much more incremental in nature. And that's what Amitai Etzioni would refer to as mixed scanning. I think it makes a lot of sense, again, intuitively and from a logical perspective. Big issues rational, small issues incremental. It kind of it's something that kind of appeals to us from that commonsensical perspective. But there is a major glaring problem with mixed scanning. Anybody want to venture a guess as to what the major problem is with mixed scanning? This, rationality for big issues and incrementalism for small issues?
Maybe not everybody has like the same amount of common sense or thinks the same.
Absolutely, I would agree. Not everyone has the same opinion about what's a big issue and what's a small issue. What is a big issue for one person may appear to be a much smaller, more mundane issue for someone else. And so it's really difficult for us to, gauge where the issue stands in terms of being a big issue or a small issue. So there is certainly some of that subjectivity that is involved in determining when we should be rational and when we should be incremental. So sometimes it's not quite as direct and quite as easy for us to know how to implement mixed scanning, but at least gives us an idea of how we can combine the two worlds together dependent upon the type of problem or issue that we're trying to address with our policies. My favorite of the four decision-making models is garbage can model of decision making. And that comes to us by way of authors Cohen, March, and Olson. Now, I love their decision-making model. I love their theory. Where I struggle is with the name of the theory. I'm not a big fan of the use of the term garbage can model because whenever you think about a garbage can way of making decisions, you think of you got a garbage can, you throw all these ideas in, you just randomly shake it up and then pull an idea out. There's a lot more rhyme and reason to it than just that. And garbage can model decision making is really very much built upon John Kingdon and his theory that we talked about on the first slide. For Cohen, March, and Olson in garbage can model decision making, policy decisions tend to be made at what they call the confluence of four different streams. So here we have four streams, and when those four streams flow together, that tends to be when we make our major policy decisions or we make a major departure from the way in which we've addressed a policy in the past. The first stream is what they call the participant stream. The participant stream means that you have to have people in policy-making positions who are predisposed to making a big change to this policy. So they have to be predisposed to doing something different than just an incremental change from last year. So you have to have the quote unquote right participants in place. Then, number two, you have a problem stream. In this problem stream, just like the problem stream with John Kingdon, you've got all these different problems, all these different issues. They're all floating around out there in that stream. Then, alongside that, you have a solution stream. You have all these different solutions to different problems that are floating around out there in your solution stream. Where garbage can model decision making is different than the other ones is that most decision making models are linear in nature, in that you identify a problem and then you generate a solution to that specific problem. Problems predate solutions. I like to call garbage can model decision making more the Quentin Tarantino approach to decision making. If you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that oftentimes they're non-sequential. Well, this is also can be a non-sequential type of decision making. Solutions can actually predate problems. So we have a modern day problem. The solution for that problem may have already been generated 3, 4, or 5 decades ago as a solution to another type of problem, but we can take that solution and we can apply it to a present day problem. One example of that could be in terms of the welfare reform in the mid 1990s. And I think we had mentioned welfare reform in a previous class session, but in welfare reform, what Congress and the president did is they started utilizing more block grants to replace the existing categorical grants. Those block grants, yeah, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act in a sad face because there are a lot of problems certainly with it, but that's come to be known as welfare reform. What it did is that you replace these categorical grants with these block grants, temporary assistance and needy family grants. Block grants were not created in 1996 for the problem of welfare reform. Block grants have been created decades earlier for other types of problems. In response to the Great Depression in FDR's New Deal, some of those grants really looked and felt a whole lot like block grants. So we took a block grant from decades earlier and we applied it to a present day problem. So solutions can actually predate those problems. And then the fourth stream, if you will, is what's called a choice opportunity or a triggering event. And I guess the term you use really depends upon what that event really is. Because it's kind of hard to say, that terrorist attacks on September 11th were a choice opportunity. It's just that's not a good way to refer to it. They were a triggering event. So what happens with this choice opportunity, this triggering event? Something occurs that galvanizes public opinion and galvanizes the opinion of policymakers to agree that a major change needs to occur. Something needs to occur. We need to develop a policy. How many times do you hear people say there ought to be a law? When people say there ought to be a law, they're oftentimes saying there should be a policy that governs this. And so, whenever you have that triggering event that galvanizes opinion around we need to make a major change, all those four streams have now flowed together, and that tends to be where we get our major policy changes coming from. So let me give you a classic example of garbage can model of decision making in policy. So several years ago, back in the 1990s, we had this Value Jet 582 crash. So Value Jet 582 crashed in the Florida Everglades and ended up resulting in the death of 110 people. The problem that was identified in terms of airline safety is that on that Value Jet 582 flight, there was a fire that had broken out in the cargo bay of the plane. There were no smoke detectors. There was no way for the crew to know that a fire was going on in the cargo bay of the plane. They didn't realize there was a fire on board until that fire had already done enough damage to the electrical system in the plane that the plane was unrecoverable and then unfortunately crashed into the Florida Everglades. So we know what the problem is. And the problem is inability to identify a fire in the cargo bay of a plane. We had the participants in place in that you had these consumer rights groups who were advocating for safer air travel. And so they saw this and they really grabbed onto this as a major issue, and we've got to fix this so this doesn't happen again. We had members of Congress understanding that they were getting a lot of political pressure from their constituents who were concerned about airline safety, so they were motivated to try and make a major change to the way in which you address the issue. Uh, the solution is a solution that predated 1990s, and that was the use of smoke detectors. So very simply, if we could promulgate a policy that requires the presence of smoke detectors in the cargo bay of all planes, then we have a solution to apply to the problem so that we can resolve the problem and so we won't have another Value Jet 582 crash. So it's kind of an example of how all four of those streams kind of all flowed together to then get this new legislation, this new policy that requires putting smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. I like the garbage can model of decision making because I think it really does a good job of describing to us why we make these major changes to our policies. Would Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 being ready for a Republican president be an example? I think it could be. I think that they were waiting for their window of opportunity, and that choice opportunity was the election of a Republican president who would be amenable to implementing all these things in the platform of Project 2025. And so, yeah, this was something, these were all solutions that were pre-existing. Once they got someone in office, then they had the ability to make those types of changes. Patriot Act, another example. Oftentimes, we do have these ideas, these policy approaches coming out of these think tanks that will then, kind of waiting and percolating there for a while until the political climate is ripe for them to then be able to implement these quote unquote solutions. So I do like garbage can model decision making. I think that not with every policy, but with a lot of our policies, if you go back and look at how that policy was formulated, I think you can see at least some aspects of garbage can model decision making in the formulation of the policy. So those are four different ways in which we can make decisions in formulating policies. Again, there is no one answer. There is no one best approach to making decisions. It really depends a lot on the politics. And you got to go back to those streams. It goes back to Kingdom's politics stream, the nature of the problem, whether or not there is a pre-existing solution, whether or not there is some type of an event that occurred that would speed up and exacerbate the policy making process. So it really is very much policy issue dependent. But just give you an idea of how we sometimes make these decisions in policy formulation. When you get to 670, you're going to talk a lot more about agenda setting. You'll talk more about policy formulation. And what you'll talk a lot more about in 670 is stakeholders. And so in your 670 class, you'll talk extensively about how to identify stakeholders, who are these stakeholders, what are their vested interests in terms of these policy outcomes, and what types of resources do they have to then influence policy outcomes. And so we don't talk a lot about stakeholders here because just kind of a little quick overview of policy formulation, but you'll do a lot in 670 on stakeholders. You'll put together a policy analysis, and in that policy analysis, one of the primary aspects of that analysis will be identifying the stakeholders, who's involved, what resources do they have, and what are their ultimate goals with the creation of this policy. When you get to 697 and you do your policy analysis case study, you'll be doing the same type of thing. You'll be putting together a policy analysis for that case, and the rubric for that analysis really does look very heavily at the identification of those stakeholders, who's involved, and what their vested interests are. But we know public administrators are very much involved in policy formulation. We've talked about that kind of ad nauseum in previous class sessions, so I don't think we have to spend a lot of time talking about it here again tonight. We do know they're very involved in formulating policy, providing advice and opinions to those policy makers. We know that when policies are formulated and they are passed into law, they then have to be implemented. And so we then shift from formulation into implementation. And this is where the work of public administration becomes even more prominent. So we as administrators, we need to implement and execute these policies. One of the most famous studies looking at the policy implementation phase of the process comes to us from Pressman and Wildowski, Jeffrey Pressman and Aaron Wildowski. And Pressman and Wildowski did kind of this classic seminal study looking at the implementation of the Economic Development Agency in Oakland, California. And they wanted to see what were some of the obstacles and what were some of the problems with effectively implementing this policy. Sometimes policy implementation will fail because it is a poorly designed policy. But at other times, you can have a very well designed, well formulated policy that even though it's well designed, it still fails at the implementation stage. And so Preston Wildowski wanted to understand why the EDA was failing so miserably in Oakland, California. In their study, this Economic Development Agency, what Pressman and Wildowski found is that there were multiple issues that were obstacles toward effective implementation. Some of those obstacles were things such as multiple goals. Sometimes policies have multiple goals. When you have a multiplicity of goals, those goals come into conflict with each other. And sometimes implementers do not know which of those goals to try and pursue, especially if they conflict with each other. So a lack of clear goals was a problem. A second problem was the number of decision points in the implementation process. The rule of thumb here is the more decisions that implementers have to make in terms of how to implement a policy, the less successful implementation tends to be. And Preston Wildowski came up with what they called their complexity theory. And their complexity theory, they made the argument that let's assume that in the implementation of a policy, there are 30 different decision points, 30 different times where decisions need to be made. Let's then assume that there's a 95% success rate at each of those 30 decision points. So 30 decision points, each of those decisions have a 95% success rate. You calculate that out in their theory, and that means that when you have those 30 decision points and 95% success at each decision point, your overall chance of success is 21%. So think about that. The overall chance of success for that policy is only a 21% chance of success. So the more decisions that have to be made by more uh, implementers, the less successful implementation tends to be. Third, Preston Wodowski pointed out the opinions about the policy and the intensity of those opinions on the part of implementers was a major obstacle. And that was probably the primary obstacle to effective implementation. So if you have implementers who are strongly opposed to the goals of this policy, the policy is never going to be properly implemented. They're going to use interposition, they're going to use a lot of strategies to make sure that that is never properly implemented. By contrast, if you have implementers who are strongly positive about the policy goals, you're going to have much more successful implementation. Fourth, the amount of bargaining that goes on within the implementation process is another problem. The more bargaining there is, the less successful implementation is going to be. And not only the frequency of bargaining, but what is being bargained about. So if implementers are bargaining with each other over the very essentials of a policy, chances are implementation is not going to work very well. If, however, they're only arguing about the peripherals, kind of arguing around the edges and bargaining around the edges, then you have a higher likelihood of success. And then finally, the creation of new agencies. One of the favorite things for the federal government to do is when they create a federal policy and they need it implemented at the state or local level, they will then create a new agency, and that new agency will then be in charge of implementing that policy. Sometimes those newly created agencies created by the federal government will then make it more difficult to implement the policy because they will then butt heads and come to loggerheads with state and local agencies. And state and local agencies oftentimes don't get along very well with those newly created federal agencies. Alexander, a question: intensity of outside participants or implementers. Here we're looking primarily at the implementers, the people who are charged with implementing the policy, and how their direction, their intensity of support or opposition for the policy. So let's look at the intensity and direction of participants, because that's the one of those five obstacles that Preston Wodowski really focused on. And they said this is what will probably determine the success or failure of the implementation of the policy. So in this very, simple chart, this very simple 2 by 2 table they provide for us, on your one side, you have the direction of preference. Either they are positive or have negative feelings toward the policy. And then your columns, you have their intensity. Either they are very strongly positive or they are weakly positive, they're strongly negative, or they're weakly negative. So your best case scenario, obviously, is your top left-hand cell. Highly positive implementers means you'll have very minimal delay in implementation, and you'll have essentially no bargaining. And with no bargaining and minimal delay, that policy gets implemented relatively easily. Worst case scenario is below that. Very strongly negative opinions held by the implementers. This is where you get maximal delay. This is where you get bargaining over the very essentials of that policy. So those are the policies you fall in that box with your implementers, where those policies are simply not going to get implemented appropriately. Then your kind of mixed area is going to be in terms of their low intensity. So if you have implementers who are low positive in terms of their feelings about the policy, you might get some minor delays, but you're still not going to get a whole lot of bargaining going on. If you have people who are negative but not strongly negative about the policy, that's where you start getting to some more moderate delays, and you get a lot of bargaining, not over the essentials, but rather over the peripherals, over the margins, the smaller issues that affect the implementation of the policy. But it's really the direction and intensity of participants that Preston and Wodowski really focused on as the major determinant in terms of effective or ineffective policy implementation. So let's dig a little bit deeper then, since that was such an important uh, finding for Preston and Wodowski. Let's dig a little bit deeper in terms of the amount of support and the way in which implementers support the policy. Martha Durthick, who is another very famous public administration scholar, she focused on implementation as well and kind of built off Preston Wildowski. She makes the argument that yes, you want to have implementers who have strong positive feelings about implementing this policy. And according to Durthick, the best way to accomplish that, the most appropriate way to accomplish that, is by involving the implementers in the formulation of that policy. So if you involve those administrators who are charged with implementation in the very design and formulation of the policy, they're going to have some quote unquote skin in the game. They're going to have some buy-in in the successful implementation of that policy. So they are going to be more likely to work toward effective implementation. So Durthick tells us we need to involve these implementers. Involving implementers in policy implementation is very similar to what Mary Parker Follett told us about involving employees in the daily decision making of an organization. The more people are involved, the more likely they are to accept the results of those decisions and then implement those results. But even the best designed policies can fail at the implementation stage. Once we have implemented these policies, then the next phase we move into is evaluation. We want to know how effective these policies have been. Are these policies achieving their stated goals and objectives? Are they having the desired positive impacts on those policy beneficiaries? So when we go into evaluation, we need to evaluate effectiveness. The problem with evaluation in policy is that with policy, sometimes the policy outcomes are not as quantifiable as are outcomes that come from public programs. And so it becomes a little bit more difficult for us to measure those outcomes from policies. One of the tools we use in evaluation of public policies is a tool known as a cost effectiveness analysis. Contrast that to the cost benefit analysis that tends to be used as a primary tool in program evaluation. Cost effectiveness analysis doesn't really look at monetizing the costs and the benefits of a policy because it's difficult to monetize those costs and benefits because the outcomes are oftentimes much more general and amorphous in nature. So instead, in a cost effectiveness analysis, we ask the question that are we achieving enough to justify continuing to put money into this public policy? And that's usually what we are asking with our evaluations. So are we getting enough out of this policy to justify continuing to fund this policy in future fiscal years? The problem we run into in doing these types of evaluations is that we oftentimes evaluate policies too soon. The outcomes of these policies sometimes will not accrue for a number of months or a number of years. If you go and you evaluate a policy too early, after a month, and those outcomes have not had a chance to manifest themselves yet, then obviously the policy is going to look like a failure. So one of the things we do in policy evaluation is we conduct these things called evaluability assessments. And it kind of sounds like the Office of Redundancy, but basically we're evaluating policies to make sure that they are ready to be evaluated. So we ask questions such as, are there operational indicators that are ready to be measured for this policy? If they're ready to be measured, then we can evaluate the policies. If they're not ready to be measured, then we're going to have to wait. And so, for instance, if you have some type of a policy that is geared toward job training, and the purpose of the job training is to enhance the employability of these candidates. Well, job training is going to take some time. And so you're not going to be able to evaluate it 2 or 3 weeks in because the job training is not over with. It may be a 6 month or a 9 month or a year-long training program. So you're going to have to wait before you're able to evaluate their employability as a result of that job training program. So evaluation and policy can sometimes be a lot trickier than evaluating public programs. Public programs tend to be a little bit more direct. Their outcomes tend to be a little bit more short term than what we have with these more general public policies. We do audits. We know we do a lot of audits in the public sector. You'll talk a lot about auditing when you take the PPA 555 public budgeting course. But when we do these types of evaluations and audits, we do financial audits, we do management-based audits, Financial audits ask us if we're spending the money in the way in which we're supposed to spend the money that's legally appropriated for this policy. Management or performance-based audits will ask us about those outcomes. Are these policies achieving what we are intending to achieve with this public policy? In 670, when you get to policy analysis, you're going to focus primarily upon policy formulation, agenda setting, identification of stakeholders. Then, to a little bit lesser extent, you'll also talk a little bit about implementation. But the policy analysis that you will put together will be essentially a design that if you were to evaluate this policy, how would you evaluate this policy? Which is a similar type of thing that you will do when you get to PPA 696, Research Methods Program Evaluation. The difference will be that in program evaluation, because our outcomes are much more empirical and measurable, we have more of an ability to kind of model our program evaluations more after research designs. So your kind of research design you would put together in social science research methods course, we can use a similar type of design to evaluate public programs. So when you get to 696, what you'll be doing is looking at the specific programs that support these overarching policies and then putting together a design for how you would evaluate this program if you were in the position to evaluate the program. We obviously need to analyze our policies and evaluate our programs to make sure that our policies and our programs are effective, that they are achieving their stated goals and objectives. At the end of the day, that is really what policy analysis and program evaluation is really all about. So in program evaluation in 696, you'll talk about how you can apply empirical methods to determine the effectiveness of a public program. So we focus program evaluation on empiricism. We've talked about empiricism in this class before. We talked about Max Weber. Empiricism just means information data that is tangible, information we can collect, information we can analyze, and then information we can use to then render decisions and conclusions. So the information we're using in our program evaluation will be empirical information. When we evaluate public programs, there are two basic approaches as public administrators we can take. We can do a program impact evaluation or a program implementation evaluation, or we can combine the two together into one. But program impact evaluation, we are focusing on, did this program have its intended outcome? Program implementation, obviously, how efficiently are we implementing the program? So program impact evaluations typically look at effectiveness. Program implementation evaluations will oftentimes look more at efficiency of implementation. But again, you can combine those two together into one program evaluation. So how do we evaluate public programs from this empirical basis? Well, our steps in program evaluation are going to very closely mirror and model the steps in doing a research type of a design. So just like in classic social science research, we have to identify our research question. Well, here in program evaluation, we will identify an evaluation question. So the characteristics of an evaluation question are similar to the characteristics of a good research question. It should be clear in that the terms used in this evaluation question should be easily understood by everyone. And this question should be answerable and have more than one possible answer. So questions that are answerable are questions that can be answered based upon empirical evidence. So questions about faith or belief, those are usually not good evaluation questions. Questions that are normative in nature in terms of, well, should or ought this happen? Those also tend to be value-based and tend to be much more subjective. We want questions that can be answered with empirical data, and our questions should have more than one possible answer. If an evaluation question only has one possible answer, we probably already know what that answer is. So here are a couple of examples of evaluation questions we could use in program evaluation. This is what I like to call a rip from the headlines. And so this comes from a 696 research methods case study that was used a few years ago in 697. The first one, does the inmate reading intervention program decrease rates of recidivism? In the case study that was used for that research methods case, you had the creation of this inmate reading intervention program. It was a program that was provided to inmates to help enhance literacy levels, with the idea being that as you do that, you can then decrease rates of recidivism. That is a very directional question in that we're asking, does participation in the program decrease rates of recidivism? So we are asking a directional question. The second example is a non-directional question. How does the inmate reading intervention program affect rates of recidivism? So we're not saying they're going to decrease them. We're asking, how do they affect them? So as you know from your undergraduate research methods classes, this is the difference between a one-tailed and a two-tailed test. One-tailed test would be used for a directional evaluation question. A two-tailed test would be used for a non-directional research question, because we have to open up the possibility that this reading intervention program may decrease rates of recidivism, but it may also increase rates of recidivism. That would be this type of a two-tailed test. So we come up with a good, clear, answerable evaluation question that oftentimes mirrors the characteristics of a good research question. Secondly, we have to identify the variables and operational indicators of those variables, just like we do in classic research methods. So we're usually measuring the relationship between independent and dependent variables. The difference is in program evaluation, the dependent variable is usually the outcome of the program. This is a variable that's being affected by your independent variable. Usually, this is the outcome of the program itself, and that's our dependent variable. Our primary independent variable will be some measure of the program. Now, there are a lot of different ways in which you can measure programs in a program evaluation. One way you can measure it is in terms of participation, and you could do it in a binary type of manner. Either the inmate participated in the reading program or the inmate did not participate in the reading program. So a 1 if they participated and a 0 if they did not participate. That's a very similar, a very simple binary way of measuring participation in the program. We could get a little bit more nuanced if we would like, and we could measure the amount of time that they participated in the program. We might be able to measure that in terms of the number of hours that they spent participating in the program. That would be a much more nuanced interval level type of measurement of program participation. So we can measure participation in the program as our primary independent variable. We could also measure existence of the program as our primary independent variable. So if we want to do a longitudinal type of time series analysis, we could look at recidivism rates for several years before the program was implemented and then several years after the program was implemented. In that type of approach, all those years before the program was implemented, that primary independent variable score would be a 0. Then in all the years after it was implemented, that score would then be a 1. There you are measuring program existence as opposed to an individual's participation in the program. So that's a more aggregate level way of measuring the program as your primary independent variable. But if we are looking at the impact of participation in the program on a dependent variable, we obviously need to control for the effects of other variables. Recidivism rates can be affected by a lot of different things. Criminology will tell us that recidivism rates are affected by things such as the type of crime committed, so the original crime committed, whether it's a violent or a non-violent crime. Another variable that could affect recidivism is whether or not that original crime involved the use of drugs. Because if drug use was involved, recidivism rates tend to be much higher than if there was not drug use involved. Whether or not someone has a permanent identifiable address is another predictor of whether or not someone is going to reoffend. So those would all be the control variables. Variables we would have to control for, with our primary purpose being to isolate the relationship between participation in the reading program and rates of recidivism. Because at the end of the day, that's what we are trying to do in our program evaluation is to isolate participation in the program with the desired outcome of that participation. Then just like in classic social science research, we have to select a research design. Here in program evaluation, we refer to that as an evaluation design. So it's a similar type of idea, we just use different terminology. So if you remember back to your undergraduate research course, you probably learned about experimental versus quasi-experimental designs. An experimental research design is one in which the participants in that research are randomly assigned to either be exposed to the independent variable or to not be exposed to the independent variable. Those that are exposed are referred to as an experimental group. Those that are not exposed are referred to as a control group. Now, that's in social science research. Here in program evaluation, we refer to experimental groups as being project groups and control groups as being comparison groups. So use different terminology. So an experimental group becomes a project group, a control group becomes a comparison group. So the idea here is if you are randomly assigning inmates to either participate or to not participate in the inmate reading intervention program, then that random assignment, if done correctly, will make your two groups entirely equivalent to each other, with the exception of your project group participated in the program and your comparison group did not participate in the program. If the only difference between your groups is one participated and one did not, then any differences in recidivism rates between those groups can then be directly attributed to participation in the reading program. That's the big advantage of an experimental design, like a classic experimental design, like you see up on the screen. Just to refresh your memory on that notation, the R stands for random assignment. The O stands for an observation. So this is where we're collecting data from the individual. The X stands for the independent variable. So this is when they're getting exposed to the independent variable. And then the second O would be a post observation after exposure to the independent variable. So that's the ROXO notation. So that's a classic experimental design. We oftentimes cannot do that in program evaluation. We cannot do that because we are limited in terms of legal limitations, ethical limitations, and practical limitations. So, in terms of legal limitations, if this program that we are trying to evaluate is an entitlement-based program, it means that by law, people who meet the eligibility requirements are legally entitled to those benefits. So if we tell someone we're not going to allow you to participate in this program for the purposes of our evaluation, we are then denying them their legally entitled benefits. That would be against the law. So we cannot do that legally. Ethically, it's also very problematic because if people will benefit from participation in this program, we're denying them participation, then ethically we are harming that individual. So there's an ethical problem. There's also a practical problem in terms of we don't control these programs. These are programs that are out of our control as an evaluator. So we don't decide when these programs start and when these programs end. So it makes it difficult for us to randomly assign some people to participate, some to not participate, when we don't control the start and the end of those types of programs. I'm sorry about UBI. What is that?
Universal basic income.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, yeah, that's a great example. Yes, that would be something that would be in time of program. It would be something that we cannot deny people benefits for that type of a program. So that would be a good example. So we oftentimes cannot do these types of experimental approaches. So instead of an experimental evaluation design, we oftentimes have to use a quasi-experimental design. So since we cannot randomly assign people to participate or not participate, we cannot ensure that the project and the comparison group are equivalent. So in order to make sure that they are equivalent, we have to control through the use of statistics. So we will create control variables and then measure our participants and our non-participants on those control variables to determine that they are truly equivalent on all those variables with the exception of participation in the program. So that's what's known as a quasi-experimental design. We typically need to use a quasi-experimental design for our public program evaluations. One of the most common types of quasi-experimental designs is again this longitudinal time series analysis. So we will measure our variables over time. We will look at changes and interruptions in the patterns over time. So we will look at the dependent variable before the implementation of the program, dependent variable after the implementation of the program in this type of a longitudinal time series approach. That type of approach of looking at a pattern before and after implementation of a public program is a specific type that's known as an interrupted time series analysis. Interrupted time series analysis. So we look at is participation in this program interrupting these patterns we've seen before the program versus patterns we see after the program. But the big takeaway here is our evaluation designs are typically quasi as opposed to experimental in nature. Just like in classic or social science research, we have to decide where our information is coming from, what participants we are using in our evaluation, and that brings us to sampling. We have to put together a sample because we oftentimes don't have the ability to collect our information from all program participants, so we have to put together a sample of those participants. How you put that sample together will depend upon whether you do it randomly or non-randomly. If you do it randomly, you are doing a probability sampling design. If you're not doing it randomly, you're doing a non-probability type of sampling design. Probability sampling designs are oftentimes favored, especially if we want to generalize our results from our sample to our population. If you remember from research methods, that's what's known as external validity. So external validity is our ability to take the results from our design and then generalize, extrapolate those results to the larger target population. We can do that more accurately by using a probability type of sampling design. I've listed on the screen there for you four different types of probability random sampling designs. From the first one, simple random, is the most random type of sampling design. So simple random, we would have a list of all program participants. We would then number all those participants. We do a random number generator to then select participants to become part of our sample. It's simple random in nature. It will give us the most representative sample possible. Problem with that is we sometimes do not have that list of participants. The list of participants would be our sampling frame. We oftentimes don't have that at our disposal. So we'll have to use something else. Another approach that's oftentimes used in program evaluation is what's called systematic sampling, that third bullet point there on the screen for you. Systematic sampling, if we don't have a list of participants, then we have to do something else. So in systematic sampling, an example of that would be you have a local health clinic. We want to survey people who are using that local health clinic to find out how satisfied they are with the services that they're required from this health clinic. Because this health clinic provides services on an anonymous basis, we lack that sampling frame. So instead, what we may do is we may position ourselves outside of that local health clinic, and then we will question every 10th person or every 20th person who walks out of that health clinic. Whether we interview the 20th person or the 10th person, that's known as our skip interval. So our skip interval is we'll interview one person, we'll skip the next 10, interview the next one, skip the next 10, interview the next one. That at least gives us an approximation of the feelings of people who are using the services in that local health clinic. Um, yeah, well, we do many of the same statistical analyses we would do in classic social science research to see whether or not, or the likelihood that this sample comes from a population. We can do hypothesis testing, so we can do t-tests. We can do, post hoc tests. We can do measures of association. We do a lot of things to try and test whether or not this sample is truly coming from the population, truly represents our population. If we're doing multiple regression, that's what our adjusted R square will help tell us is the likelihood that this sample came from that population. So you're exactly right, Martin. A lot of those statistical analyses we do in classic research methods, we also use and apply to program evaluation. Stratified random sampling is if you have a characteristic that is of importance to you and your research. What you'll do is you may want to stratify or split up your sample according to that important characteristic. And that's called stratified random sampling. And then the fourth one is one we do a lot in the public sector is multi-stage cluster sampling. The Census Bureau back in the day, when the Census Bureau did a lot of research, the Census Bureau used multi-stage cluster sampling for the vast majority of the evaluations they did outside of that 10-year enumeration of the population. 10-year enumeration of the population, that's something that is a constitutional requirement. And we actually had some challenges to that census, every 10-year census, that we had some folks saying that the way in which the Census Bureau was doing it was not truly an enumeration. That to truly do enumeration, you have to go out there and count every single person in the country. Well, that's obviously very difficult to do. So we still do some sampling there, but the most common way in which we do sampling is a multi-stage cluster sample. Now, this is very useful if you don't have a sampling frame at the unit of analysis that you are interested in. So let's say we are looking at a program evaluation for a program, and we want to see how that program is benefiting households. So our unit of analysis will be a household. We probably don't have a list of every single household in the state of California. So we do multi-stage cluster sampling. We may take all the counties in California and then take a random sample of those counties. From that random sample of counties, we'll then take a random sample of cities. From that random sample of cities, we'll then take a random sample of neighborhoods. From that random sample of neighborhoods, we'll then take a random sample of streets. From that random sample of streets, we'll then take a random sample of households, and that then gets us down to the unit of analysis that we are interested in. So at every stage of that cluster, we have a random component to it. It's not purely random, but it allows us to put together a list of the households, which is the unit of analysis that we are interested in. It's still considered probability sampling because you still have an element of probability, of randomness. The second category are our non-probability sampling designs. In our non-probability sampling designs, we don't have a lot of great assurance that our sample really does come from our population and really does represent our population. So here we're doing things such as convenience sampling. Convenience sampling would be I want to know what people think about PPA 500. And so we're all together here on Wednesday evenings. So I ask you what you think about PPA 500. I don't know if your feelings about 500 are representative of everyone else in the distance learning program, or if the feelings in the distance learning program are representative of everyone else in the MPA program. I don't know that. So this is just kind of like a first crack at trying to answer that question. It's very much done based upon convenience of the evaluator. So we have a lot of external validity issues. Another non-probability approach that doesn't use random sampling is snowballing. Snowballing is a non-probability approach that can be used if we have a population that is difficult to access. So you think about people who lack affordable and adequate housing. They do not have a permanent address, and so we can't send them a survey. They probably don't have access to an email, so we can't send them an email survey. So we have to talk to them in person. So we find one person, we talk to them, we interview them, we then ask them to refer us to someone else who meets those same characteristics. So someone else who lacks affordable housing, interview that second person, they then refer you to someone else, and so on and so on. It's clearly snowball sampling because as you talk to more people, your sample gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It snowballs. But again, those non-probability designs will give us a lot of trouble in terms of generalizing to a larger population. But they are cheaper, they are much easier to do. If you're very early in the process of evaluating your program, this type of non-probability design could save you a lot of money and get you a little bit of insight initially into what you're trying to measure with that program. Then later on, when you really do want to draw conclusions about the effectiveness of the program, that's when you might want to be able to shift more to a probability type of sampling design. Step five, just like in classic research methods, we then collect our data. We're collecting sometimes qualitative data, sometimes we're collecting quantitative data, sometimes we'll use qualitative approaches, quantitative approaches. Probably more likely, we're going to use somewhat more of a mixed methodology where we'll try and combine both qualitative as well as quantitative data into our approach. Whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative or mixed methodology will dictate how you collect your data. One of the most common ways we collect data in program evaluation is through survey research. Surveys are very useful tools to us because they can collect both qualitative as well as quantitative information. We can collect qualitative information from open-ended survey questions, quantitative information from closed-ended survey questions. So if we're doing kind of a mixed methodology, combining the two together, survey research can be very useful for us. There are obviously problems with survey research in terms of errors and measurement errors. So let's be very careful how we design our surveys, how we sequence our questions. You never want to have a sensitive question at the beginning of the survey because that will turn your respondents off and make it less likely that they will continue and finish the remainder of your survey. That will give you a lot of problems with your response rates. Low response rates mean that it's difficult for us to have external validity and generalize to a larger population. You'll talk in 696 about how you design surveys. When I used to teach 696, I don't know if Dr. Butts still does this, but I would spend a week pretty much on survey construction and all the different nuances and how you put these surveys together to avoid measurement error. We also rely a lot upon secondary data. Now, today, this is a little different than it used to be in that a lot of the databases that used to be provided by federal agencies have now been scrubbed from the internet. And so they may have been there a year ago and they may not be there anymore. So we're kind of getting a little bit more limited in terms of our ability to use those existing data sets. One good strategy, though, is if you are looking for a data set and you cannot find it online, contact the library, especially Kelly Janicek. I provided a video for you from Kelly Janicek about how to do research in public administration. Kelly has been very good at archiving a lot of those data sets before they were removed. So back in January and February and March of 2025, she was archiving these data sets, making sure that we have continuing access to them. So I think our library's done a really nice job of keeping our access to those secondary data sets. We then have to analyze our data, and this is the use of statistics. Program evaluation has become far more sophisticated in recent years in terms of statistical analysis. So in the past, where we used to use measures of association and hypothesis tests and OLS regression, now we're using more sophisticated measures. Now we're using econometrics. Now we are using binary logistic regression and probit and logit and survival analysis. And so we have become a lot more sophisticated in how we evaluate the data in our program evaluations. The data that we use will obviously depend upon the type of evaluation we are doing. So if we're doing a very simple descriptive evaluation, so for instance, we just want to know the demographic profile of people who are using this public program, that's a very simple evaluation. We would just have to use descriptive types of statistics. This is where we do all of our old friends, mean and median and mode and standard deviation and all those good things. Very simple descriptive statistics. If, however, we want to see if participation in the program is associated with a certain type of outcome, that moves us into our associational statistics. And so that's where we will use statistics such as a Pearson's R for interval level data. Maybe we'll use a Kendall's tau B for ordinal level data, gamma for ordinal level data, and so on. Those are really simple measures of association to see if participation in the program is associated with this outcome. What we typically do, though, in program evaluation is the higher level of causal analysis, where we will ask what is the impact of participating in this program on our dependent variable, the outcome. Whenever we're doing causal analysis, this is what then moves us into the realm of multiple regression, binary logistic regression if we want to use participation in a program to predict an outcome. So this is where we really get into different types of regression analysis, and this is a more sophisticated way of analyzing our data. But if your goal in your program evaluation is to see how participation in this program is affecting the outcomes of the program for these individuals, that's when you're going to have to use something like a causal type of analysis. And then, since this is empirical in nature, we take all that, we combine all that data together and use it to arrive at our conclusions. Conclusions about the effectiveness and or the efficiency of this public program. Typically, what usually gets top billing in program evaluation will be effectiveness because we want to know whether or not this program is being effective, so we'll know whether or not to continue putting money into that program. That then leads us to this idea of effectiveness, and this is a really good time for us to take our break because it's already 7:40. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break, come back from the break, and we will talk about this idea of effectiveness and how do we measure and how do we know when our public policies and our public programs and our public organizations are truly achieving the effectiveness that they are desiring to achieve. So come on back at 7:50. We'll talk about effectiveness and I'll show you the 4 different models of measuring effectiveness. It's 7:50, so we are back. I am still here, even though I was having my camera off. So far, so good on my internet connectivity, but I don't want to tempt fate, so I'll go ahead and turn my camera off again. Uh, So at this point, we've talked about the role of public administrators in leading and managing organizations, PPA 660. We've talked about policy analysis, and that was your 670. We talked about program evaluation, that was your 696. But whether we are leading our organizations, whether we are participating in policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation, whether we are evaluating public programs, one of our ultimate goals here is effectiveness. We want to make our organizations effective. We want our policies to be effective. We want our public programs to be effective as well. We also understand that in public administration, we do have a myriad of values that we are trying to adhere to, and effectiveness is only one of those values. But we oftentimes really do focus on effectiveness because we are, again, managing public resources. And so it's up to us to make sure that those resources are being spent in the most effective way possible. So we have talked up to this point in time a lot about effectiveness, measuring policies and programs for effectiveness, making our organizations effective. But I think it's a good time for us to take a little step back and look at this true term of effectiveness and what effectiveness really does mean in public administration. I think from a kind of a general perspective, we all have a pretty decent idea of what we mean by the term effectiveness. Usually, when we are talking about effectiveness, we are talking about our ability to achieve our goals. So, something is effective if it is achieving its goal. That, however, is only one way to measure effectiveness. And I want to introduce you to 4 different approaches to effectiveness and how we can measure effectiveness across our organization's policies and programs. The first approach, as I mentioned, the most common one is the goal attainment approach. How well have we achieved our goals? A second one is known as the systems resource approach. A third one is called the participant satisfaction approach to effectiveness. And the fourth one is the internal process model of effectiveness. So let's look at those four effectiveness models in turn and see how they are similar, how they're different, their advantages and their disadvantages. So let's start with the most common one, the goal attainment approach. So something is effective if it is achieving its goal. Obviously, that is the simplest approach, is the link between the organization, the program, the policy, and its stated goals. And if it's achieving its stated goals, then we consider it to be effective. The shortcoming associated with the goal attainment approach is that it doesn't really consider a lot of the complications that occur. It assumes that there is a clearly stated goal and that we can develop empirical indicators to indicate whether or not we are achieving that goal, that stated desired level of output. It really does view the management of organizations and policies and programs as being a very rational and orderly type of process with a singular expression of goals. If you've done any work in public administration at the undergraduate level, you're probably aware that organizations have different types of goals. And the two broad categories of goals are what we call official goals. Oops. Official goals and, well, misspelled that because I'm talking and typing official goals and operative goals. Official goals are those long-term goals of the organization. Operative goals are those shorter term goals that will help move us along the way to achieving our long term official goal. So, an official goal of the MPA program may be the goal of making sure that students, when they graduate, have the skills they need to effectively lead and manage public and nonprofit organizations. And that really is one of our goals as a program. That's an official long term goal. But we have multiple operative goals to help us get to that point in time. And those operative goals will come from our individual courses. And so in your public budgeting and finance course, one of your operative goals may be to develop the ability to correctly analyze and develop a public sector budget. That is an operative goal that will eventually, hopefully, lead you toward more effective leadership and management of a public or nonprofit organization. So, when we are using the goal attainment approach, sometimes we don't really define, are we achieving the official goal or are we achieving the operative goals? Because you may be very effective at achieving your operative goals, but have not gotten to the point of achieving your official goal yet. When we have official and operative goals, we hope that those goals are mutually complementary, but we understand that there is a possibility that goals can conflict with each other. And so sometimes the goal attainment approach is a little bit too simple of a way of measuring the effectiveness of an organization, a policy, or a program. So there are other models of effectiveness that we can also consider. The second way in which we can measure effectiveness is through what's called the systems resource approach. In the systems resource approach, we look at effectiveness as being a measure of how well we have been able to obtain valuable resources from our environment. This is an approach that is commonly used with measuring the effectiveness of an organization. So if it's difficult for us to measure our goals because we don't have clearly stated goals, we can instead measure the effectiveness of the organization by how well it has acquired resources that it needs to carry out its daily functions. So has it been able to obtain and exploit resources from its external environment? This is essentially that open systems theory that we talked about when we talked about the theoretical approaches to public administration. The problem here is that the systems resource approach is sometimes difficult for us to measure because what we have to do is we have to take a longitudinal type of an approach. We have to measure the resources the organization has at some beginning point in our analysis of effectiveness and compare it to the resources the organization has at some endpoint. So we have to kind of know where we started and where we are at today. The systems resource approach, measuring effectiveness by the acquisition of resources from the external environment, is typically useful when the other indicators, such as goals, are difficult to obtain or difficult to measure. So, oftentimes, this systems resource approach to effectiveness is something that's used as kind of a backup when we do not have clearly defined goals to use for the goal attainment approach. Again, the systems resource approach, how well are we pulling in and exploiting resources from our external environment? So, an organization could be deemed to be effective if it has done a good job of bringing in staffing and bringing in people as employees who have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job. That could be a measure of effectiveness. If the organization has been effective at increasing its appropriations from one year to the next, that could also be a measure of effectiveness. So, just another way of measuring effectiveness. Then, a third model of effectiveness is what's called the participant satisfaction model. The participant satisfaction model is an ecological model that defines effectiveness according to the ability of organizations and programs and policies, indeed, to satisfy the key strategic constituencies in the environment. So, how well are we doing? How effective are we at keeping our stakeholders happy, our constituents and our beneficiaries happy? Cities do this all the time. Cities are always sending out citizen satisfaction surveys where they ask their residents, how satisfied are you with the amount of services you're receiving? How satisfied are you with the mix of services that you are receiving? So they will ask citizens how happy they are. That's a citizen satisfaction, a participant satisfaction approach to measuring effectiveness. We do the same thing with our programs as well, in that we'll send out these surveys to program beneficiaries to ask them, how satisfied are you with your participation in the program? We do this as an MPA program. We do this usually every 2 to 3 years. We will send out a survey to our current students as well as to our alumni, asking them how satisfied they are with the MPA program. And then that's information we can then use in our future reaccreditation efforts. And usually we get very strong results in that. It's very common for us to ask the question, and the kind of an indirect way of asking is, how satisfied are you? Would be, how likely are you to recommend the MPA program to colleagues, friends, and or family? Because if someone's very satisfied with the program, they are going to be very likely to recommend it. And typically, the people who respond strongly agree that yes, they would recommend the program. Those two categories usually comprise about 98% of our respondents. And so it's a really high satisfaction rate. So that's a participant satisfaction type of an approach. Now, it's important to note with a participant satisfaction model of measuring effectiveness, you can look at participants outside of the organization as well as participants within the organization. So when you look outside the organization, you're kind of blending this participant satisfaction model together with a systems resource model, an open systems approach, because you're looking at constituencies outside the organization. When you are looking inside the organization, it becomes more of a human relations, human resource type of a focus because the constituencies within the organization, those participants are going to be your employees. So it can both be outside, external, but it could also focus internally on your human resources. And then the fourth model of effectiveness is the internal process model. The internal process model will define effectiveness based upon the internal activities that are going on a daily basis within the organization. So you'll be looking for indicators of organizational health. So you'll ask questions such as indicators like the organization culture. So, what's the organization culture like? Are people buying into the culture of the organization? Do you have a positive work climate within the organization? Is there a strong team spirit, kind of what we call this esprit de corps within the organization? How much loyalty is there to the organization? Do people have a strong sense of teamwork? How much confidence, trust, and communication do you have between employees and management? Where is decision making being done? Is decision making being done near information sources, near the people who have the information, regardless of where those people are in the organization chart? So, are you making your decisions in close proximity to where those decisions are being had? Sharing of relevant facts and feelings. So, your horizontal and vertical communication and sharing of these facts and feelings. Your system of rewards to managers for performance, growth, and development of subordinates. Interaction between the organization and its incumbent parts, where whenever there are conflicts within the organization, those conflicts are resolved within the interest of the organization. So you're looking at those internal processes, essentially looking for indicators of organizational health and wellness. More specifically, some of these specific indicators we're looking at when we are measuring the effectiveness, especially of public organizations, are things such as productivity, um, profit if you're a government corporation, the quality of the outputs that are being created, accidents, growth, absenteeism, employee turnover, job satisfaction, motivation, morale, control, conflict, cohesion. So, how you're resolving conflict, is it being resolved in the to the benefit of the cohesion of the organization? Your amount of flexibility and adaptation of the organization to adapt to changes in the external environment. How good of a job the organization does in strategic planning and the setting of goals. How much goal consensus is there? Do people agree about what the goals of the organization really are? How internalized are these organizational goals? Role and norm congruence, managerial interpersonal skills, managerial task skills, information management and communication, the readiness of the organization to respond to challenges, how well the organization utilizes the environment in a systems resource type of an approach, evaluations by external entities, again, in a systems resource participation, participant satisfaction type of an approach. Stability of the organization, how much value is placed upon employees in terms of being human resources, the amount of participation and shared influence within the organization, the emphasis that's placed upon professional development for employees, and the emphasis that's placed upon the achievement of goals within the organization. Those are all kind of discrete dimensions and measures of what we would consider to be indicators of organizational effectiveness. They cut across all four of those different models. You see goals in here, you see a systems resource approach, participant satisfaction, and internal process, all cutting across those 30 discrete indicators of organizational effectiveness. So, the moral of the story here is there are different ways of measuring effectiveness in the public sector for organizations as well as for policies and for programs. Another way to take a look at these different ways of measuring effectiveness is through this matrix I have on the screen there for you from Quinn and Rohrbach. This is a matrix that I'm showing you now that we are going to talk a lot about once we get into the PPA 660 organization theory course, because we will use this competing values framework as kind of the basis for understanding all the different theoretical perspectives that have been developed on public organizations. Because the ultimate goal of most of those theoretical perspectives is effectiveness. And so this kind of illustrates for you how you can measure effectiveness. Bottom right side of the screen, you have this rational goal model. This is essentially your goal attainment model of effectiveness. Your means of achieving effectiveness with this goal attainment approach, planning and goal setting. You have to do a good job setting your goals in order to be able to know whether or not you are achieving your goals. The ends will obviously be productivity. How productive are you at achieving your ultimate stated goals? So that's kind of your rational goal, your goal attainment type of an approach. The goal attainment type of approach focuses a little bit more on the external as compared to the internal operations of the organization. And it also has more of an emphasis placed upon control as opposed to flexibility. You'll see these four different models of organizational effectiveness are arrayed on the axis of control versus flexibility and internal versus external focus. So those models that are on the right-hand side are focused more externally to the organization. Those that are on the left-hand side are focused more internally to the organization. Those that are at the top of the matrix value more flexibility in achieving effectiveness. Those at the bottom of the matrix value more control and kind of more micromanagement in terms of the achievement of effectiveness. So rational goal, the goal attainment model is in the bottom right-hand cell. Top right-hand cell is your systems resource, or as we'll talk about in our organization theory class, the open systems model. That is up in the top right-hand cell because, again, it is very much external to the organization, looking at the environment. So that puts it on the right side of the screen. And it's at the top because it favors flexibility. How the organization, how the policy, how the program can respond and adapt to its external environment. The top left, you have what's called in organization theory the human relations model. This is essentially the internal focus on the participant satisfaction model of effectiveness. So you're looking at the employees within your organization as the participants that you are trying to keep satisfied. So the way in which you measure this, the means are through cohesion and morale. The ultimate goal is human resource development, that you keep your employees happy and satisfied through developing them as human resources. It's at the top of the screen because it's a lot more flexibility. At the left side of the screen because you're looking internal to your organization and your internal stakeholders. And then the fourth, the internal process model at the bottom left, it is very much emphasis on control and internal focus. Your means of obtaining effectiveness through the internal process model, through the management of information and communication. You know you've achieved this internal process effectiveness through creating a stable and well-controlled system of processes within the organization. So all this matrix does is just kind of compares our four different models of effectiveness along those two different dimensions of internal to external focus versus flexibility to control to kind of give you a basis for kind of comparing those four different models of effectiveness. But again, the big walk away from this discussion is that there are multiple ways of measuring effectiveness. It's not always about achievement of goals. And when you cannot clearly identify your goals, there are other ways to measure the effectiveness of a public organization, a public policy, or a public program through the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction human relations model, and through the internal process model. So just kind of give you a little bit more nuance in terms of how we measure the effectiveness in public administration. Again, hold on to this because this is information that will form the basis for the comparison of all the different approaches we talk about in a few months when we get to PPA 660 organization theory. So up to this point in time, what we have essentially done is we've kind of provided the framework for you moving ahead in the program when you go ahead and take your 660 org theory, your 670 policy analysis, and your 696 research methods courses. In the time that we have remaining, what I would like to do is to begin to move into a foreshadowing of PPA 577, which is human resource management. Now, that's the course that you're going to be going into very, very quickly in a couple of weeks. And so it's good for us in this course to at least present a foundational understanding of what you will be talking about in 577 and what we have learned in the literature and public administration about effective ways to manage human resources in public and nonprofit organizations. So, where I'd like to start tonight, we're not going to get too far into this, but where I'd like to start is to kind of create a baseline for our understanding of public employment, who these public administrators are, where they come from, and how we've decided who becomes a public administrator to begin with. So this will create the foundation for then next week in the first half of class, talk about how we manage these human resources, and then the second half of class, how we manage fiscal resources as the foreshadowing for PPA 555. So we know that we have gone through several different eras in our hiring of public administrators and our view of who should be working in the public bureaucracy. We have had three primary eras of what we call public personnel management. The first era is the era of gentlemen. And again, it's called the era of gentlemen because it dates from the late 1700s, the founding of the nation, up until the 1820s. So obviously it was gentlemen. In the era of gentlemen, we selected people to be bureaucrats and to work in public administration based upon who they were. So we call it the era of gentlemen because we were selecting people to work in the federal bureaucracy because of their standing in society. So these are people who are from the quote unquote best family backgrounds, from the quote unquote best educational institutions. These are supposed to be the upper strata of the classes in society. The reason why we were picking people based upon who they were is to add legitimacy to the new fledgling national government. Today we really, well, I'll still say it. Today, we usually, when we wake up in the morning, we assume that the national government is going to be there. That was obviously not always the case. You think about in the early 1800s, we were being invaded by England, and we had the War of 1812, and we were losing that war. So there was a lot of concern. We saw the burning of the Capitol. So there was a lot of concern about how legitimate this new national government really was. So hiring these quote unquote gentlemen could then reassure members of the population that this is a legitimate enterprise, this new national government. So we have this era of gentlemen hiring people based upon who they were up until the 1820s. And then if any of you are history buffs, you are aware of what happened in the election of 1824. The presidential election of 1824 was known, and still today is known as the corrupt bargain. And in the corrupt bargain in 1824, we had multiple people running for the presidency. We had Andrew Jackson, we had John Quincy Adams, we had Henry Clay, we had multiple people running for the presidency. Whenever you have multiple people running for the presidency, it then becomes more difficult for any one person to get a majority of the votes in the Electoral College. So we had a situation in 1824 where Andrew Jackson won most of the popular vote and also won more electoral votes than any other candidate. However, because there were multiple candidates in the race, he was unable to win a majority of the Electoral College. We all know from our reading of the Constitution that whenever no one wins a majority in the Electoral College, the election then goes into the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives then chooses the president. The House of Representatives, in choosing the president, will have every congressional delegation receiving one vote in choosing the president, regardless of the size of that state delegation. So if we have a situation today where no one gets a majority in the Electoral College and it goes into the House of Representatives, California, with all of its over 50 representatives in the House of Representatives, would get one vote in the same manner as Montana gets one vote for its one representative. So every delegation gets one vote. So in 1824, when the election got thrown in the House of Representatives, you had the allegations that Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House, entered into an agreement with John Quincy Adams that Henry Clay would throw his support in the House behind John Quincy Adams to elect John Quincy Adams president. And in return, John Quincy Adams would then appoint Henry Clay to a position in his cabinet. Well, lo and behold, Henry Clay's supporters all put their support behind John Quincy Adams. That gave Adams the amount of votes he needed in the House to become president. The president then named the Congress then House then named John Quincy Adams the president. Obviously, Andrew Jackson was not very pleased with that. He was even less pleased when John Quincy Adams became president and then appointed Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. So Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams both denied that there was any corrupt bargain, any type of agreement going on. But very clearly, Henry Clay then got appointed as Secretary of State. So Andrew Jackson, angry about that, 4 years later would then go on in 1828 to trounce John Quincy Adams in the election and win the presidency, both the popular vote as well as a majority in the Electoral College. When Andrew Jackson comes into the presidency in 1828, he brings in with him a different idea about who should be doing the governing of the country. He felt that these bureaucrats in the federal bureaucracy should be ordinary, average people, that ordinary citizens have the ability to do the work of government. He also was a very partisan individual, and so he felt that he should be able to award people who helped him get elected with positions in the federal bureaucracy. As Andrew Jackson liked to called it, to the victor go the spoils. That moves us into the second era of public employment, known as the era of patronage, or sometimes called the era of spoils. Here you got your job in public administration, the federal bureaucracy, based upon not who you were, but rather who you knew. So, did you support the winning political party? Did you support the winning political candidate? If so, then you were rewarded for your support with a position in the national government. Now, obviously, that creates a lot of loyalty on the part of these bureaucrats, but it also makes these bureaucrats very much beholden to the president and the White House. Also, you are appointing people based upon their ability to round up votes for you, as opposed to their ability to actually govern while in office. One of the things that we have painfully learned over the years is that the skills it takes to win elective office are not the same skills necessarily to govern effectively. So we had people who were not prepared for these roles, so it ended up with a lot of misfeasance and malfeasance, a lot of corruption. We had this era of spoils not only at the national level, but at the local level as well, as we discussed with George Washington Plunkett and his Plunkett of Tammany Hall memoirs. As George Washington Plunkett tells us, he's seen his opportunities and he took them. In his memoir, George Washington Plunkett also gives advice to young men, and those men at the time, on how to get a job in government. And his advice to young men was do not go to college and fill your head with all that college rot, as he referred to it. Instead of filling your head with college rot, go out there and work for a party. Learn how to round up votes, learn how to help people get elected, because that's how you get your job in government. It led to a lot of this dishonest and quote unquote honest graft and corruption that Plunkett tells us about in Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And so you had this going on at the national level. You also had it going on at the local level of government in these political machines. For many years, there was a member of the House of Representatives by the name of Pendleton. And you see Pendleton there on the screen. Pendleton carried around with him draft legislation that would eliminate the era of spoils and begin our system of career civil service. He wanted to hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. The problem was that Congress was controlled by political parties. The White House was controlled by a partisan. And so, therefore, there wasn't a whole lot of a desire to get rid of the era of spoils, at least from policymakers, from elected officials, until we had the triggering event. And so going back to garbage can model decision making, going back to Kingdon's agenda setting model, we had a triggering event. That triggering event occurred in 1881 with the assassination of President Garfield. There actually is a really interesting miniseries. I forget what it was on, but it was called Death by Lightning. And it's a mini series. I just watched it a few months ago. It's really, really good. I highly recommend it. That takes you through the assassination of James Garfield. James Garfield, who won the White House in the election of 1880, was assassinated about 3 months into office. He was assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker by the name of Charles J. Guiteau. And Guiteau was someone who was a very eclectic individual. And Guiteau, at some points in his life, was a preacher. He was a writer. Tried all kinds of different things, and tried all kinds of different occupations. He had gotten involved in politics and had started writing speeches and thought he was an excellent speechwriter. So much so that he wrote some speeches for the Garfield presidential campaign and sent them to the Garfield campaign. There is no evidence that President Garfield ever read any of those speeches, let alone used any of those speeches, or even knew who Charles J. Guiteau was. Supposedly, they had met at an event as Garfield was coming out of the convention. He bumped into Charles J. Guiteau and they shook hands, but he really didn't know Guiteau. But Guiteau felt that since he wrote these political speeches, he helped Garfield get elected, and so therefore Guiteau should then be rewarded with a position in the Garfield administration. And the position he wanted is he wanted to be ambassador to France. So, always aim high, I guess. Clearly, Garfield did not appoint him to a position, so Guiteau then assassinated Garfield. And the idea here was, number one, if he assassinates Garfield, he'll become famous and he'll get his name out there, and it'll help him sell the book that he had wrote that no one was reading. But also, he felt that the vice president for James Garfield was Chester Arthur. Chester Arthur was a very ardent partisan. He believed very much in the era of patronage. And so Guiteau felt that if he assassinated Garfield, Arthur would then ascend to the presidency, and then he would appoint Guiteau to his position. Clearly, Arthur did not do that. Chester Arthur was distraught about the assassination of James Garfield. Garfield and Arthur never got along until Garfield was assassinated. And then Arthur really started to admire Garfield after his assassination, and obviously would not appoint Guiteau to anything. And Guiteau was then arrested as soon as he assassinated Garfield, was in prison, and then instead of getting a position from the administration, all he got was executed. So he was hanged, and that was the end of Charles J. Guiteau. But that was the triggering event that led people in Congress to support Pendleton's Pendleton Act. And so in 1883, 2 years later, Pendleton is then successful getting his act through Congress, called the Pendleton Act, and then signed by President Arthur. The Pendleton Act establishes for us this idea of civil service. So we will now hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So we'll institute these examinations, much like were instituted in England. These examinations would be open competitive exams. People could take these examinations. If they scored well enough on the exams, they had demonstrated the KSAs for the job, they would then be hired into the federal bureaucracy. So it ushers in this era of merit in 1883. So the Pendleton Act is on the books. We are now hiring people, at least at the federal level, based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. Also, what we did in the Pendleton Act is we insulated these administrators, these bureaucrats, from political influence. So you no longer got hired based upon politics, but you also didn't get fired based upon politics either. You retained your job based upon your job performance. So we were insulating people from politics. The problem was, while we were insulating people from politics, we were not also requiring these administrators to stay out of politics themselves. And so we fast forward then to 1940 and the Hatch Act. In the Hatch Act, what we tried to do is say, okay, if we are going to protect you as administrators from political influence, we are going to require that you do not engage in politics during your time on the job, using your public position, using any of the resources that come with your public position. So you need to be nonpartisan to enjoy these protections from political influence. So we got that Hatch Act at the federal level, and then very quickly we started getting what were called the Little Hatch Acts, that individual states started passing their own Hatch Act to then try and keep their state employees as apolitical as possible while they were on the job. Then you fast forward into the 1970s. 1978, we are now almost 100 years removed from the Pendleton Act. Between the Pendleton Act in 1883 and 1978, Congress had continued to pass a patchwork amount of different pieces of legislation to make modifications to the career civil service system. So much so that by the time we got to 1978, federal employees really had no idea what they could and could not do. They didn't know what they were allowed to do and what would be a violation of their civil service requirements. There was so much confusion that Congress decided we need to reform our civil service system, and that led to the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act. The Civil Service Reform Act was a huge piece of legislation that fundamentally redesigned the entire civil service system at the federal level. It's really beyond the scope of us here in 500 to get into all the specific details of the Civil Service Reform Act, but I do want to point out to you five of the major things that were created by this act in 1978 that are still with us in one form or another today. So we have this thing called the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, which stands for the Office of Personnel Management. The Office of Personnel Management was created to be the central clearinghouse for the personnel management function in the federal bureaucracy. So the Office of Personnel Management took on the responsibility for designing and implementing examinations that people would take to then qualify for a position in the federal bureaucracy. The Office of Personnel Management had the job as the central clearinghouse for posting all the vacancies that were available in the federal bureaucracy, administering the examinations, scoring the examinations, and then what OPM would do is they would come up with an eligibility list. So the top three or the top five scores on that examination would then make it onto an eligibility list. That eligibility list would then be shared with the hiring agency. The hiring agency could then only interview people off of that eligibility list that was provided to them by the Office of Personnel Management. Though the Office of Personnel Management really becomes the head, the top of the entire personnel management system across the federal bureaucracy. And OPM is still with us today. The difference today is that OPM has taken a much more decentralized approach to hiring in the federal bureaucracy. A lot of the positions no longer have examinations associated with them. So people, instead of taking an examination, they will sit for interviews and have their resumes reviewed in terms of their knowledge, skills, and abilities. And oftentimes that is really decentralized much more so to the federal agencies and departments than being centralized within OPM. So OPM is really kind of taking a step back from controlling every aspect of the hiring process. Secondly, the Civil Service Reform Act created an organization called the Merit Systems Protection Board. So it's the Merit Systems Protection Board, otherwise known as MSPB. We talked a little bit about the Merit System Protection Board when we talked about the Whistleblowers Act in our discussion of accountability and ethics. The Merit System Protection Board was created to just what it sounds like, to protect the merit principles of federal employees. So if you felt that your merit principles were being violated, you were being disciplined or demoted or fired based upon some type of political decision, you could take your case to the Merit System Protection Board. The MSPB would then investigate your case. They would then render a decision on your case. And then, if they decided in your favor, they could then make sure the agency provides you with your old position back, make sure the agency provides you with restitution in terms of lost salary. And so they have the opportunity through kind of a quasi-judicial function to make good on any violations to civil service protections. So it was a Merit Systems Protection Board. I think I mentioned to you when we talked about accountability and ethics, The Trump administration got rid of the head of the Merit System Protection Board, and the Supreme Court supported the president's ability to get rid of the head of that independent agency. So the Merit System Protection Board has been struggling in the past year in terms of having a leadership and having enough resources to protect career civil service. The third organization created was the Office of Special Counsel, and counsel SEL, like legal counsel, the Office of Special Counsel. Originally, it was created within the Merit System Protection Board, then pulled out and made it its own independent agency under the Whistleblower Protection Act. The Office of Special Counsel was there for people to blow the whistle if they saw violations to civil service principles going on within their organization. So these are violations that may not affect them personally. If it affected them personally, they go to the MSPB. But if they see it going on in the organization affecting others, they could blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel. We also have talked about how President Trump got rid of the head of the Office of Special Counsel, and then replaced that person with someone else, another of his appointees. The Office of Special Counsel, again, has different leadership this year under this administration, has limited workforce and limited budget under this administration. So it's kind of been hamstrung a bit in terms of its ability to protect whistleblowers. But that's what it was there for, is to protect whistleblowers. Then fourth, we get the creation of the Federal Labor Relations Authority, the FLRA, the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The Federal Labor Relations Authority was created to oversee the collective bargaining process between agencies and bargaining units. So the Federal Labor Relations Authority does the same thing for public agencies that the National Labor Relations Board does for collective bargaining in the private sector. Pretty much all federal agencies and federal employees, their collective bargaining processes are under the auspices of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The one exception to that is the U.S. Postal Service. The U.S. Postal Service is a government corporation, and so its collective bargaining process is under the control of the National Labor Relations Board, just like a private corporation. But other than that, federal agencies, their collective bargaining is under the control of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. So if a bargaining unit in its bargaining process with management decides that management is engaging in bad faith bargaining, or engaging in some type of an unfair labor practice, that bargaining unit can then take its case to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And the FLRA will then investigate that claim to determine whether or not it's a violation of federal law concerning collective bargaining. The problem for the Federal Labor Relations Authority is it got off on a very bad foot with federal employees, in that one of the first cases that it dealt with very early in the Reagan administration was Reagan's firing of air traffic controllers. So air traffic controllers wanted to get an increase in pay. They want to get changes to their work conditions in collective bargaining. They then decided to go on strike. The Reagan administration said, air traffic controller, if you go on strike, you will be fired from your position. All those air traffic controllers that went on strike were then summarily fired by the Reagan administration, and then he began a very aggressive process of hiring new air traffic controllers. These air traffic controllers made the argument, we have the ability in the collective bargaining process to go on strike. That's one of our provisions that we have. So they took their case to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. The FLRA sided with the Reagan administration. FLRA said that air traffic controllers, because they have such a direct impact upon public safety, they are not allowed to strike, and that President Reagan was well within his rights in order to fire those air traffic controllers. That decision obviously had a chilling effect, not just on the Air Traffic Controllers Union, but across the entire federal government and all federal public sector employee unions. So it took a while for the FLRA to kind of rebuild their reputation and trust with federal employee unions. The fifth thing that was created is the Senior Executive Service. Now, the Senior Executive Service was created for the purpose of trying to bridge the gap between those who are running our agencies at the top level and all the rest of the bureaucrats who work within our agencies. Our system of civil service today is kind of a hybrid system in that our agencies are headed up by political appointees. So these are appointees, these are secretaries of departments, these are directors of agencies that are appointed by the president and then in certain situations confirmed by the Senate. It depends upon the position. Some of these positions are Senate confirmed, some of them are not. But they are political appointees appointed by the president. They are the ones at the very top of the organization chart for our federal agencies and departments. Then you have your remaining employees who are all part of the career civil service. All those members of the agency that were part of the career civil service were part of what was called and still called today the general schedule. The general schedule is the position classification system for the federal government. And so every position in the federal government would have a GS category. So it would be a GS 12 step 3 or whatever the case may be. As a position classification system, depending upon where your position was classified in the general schedule, would then dictate the amount of compensation that you receive. What we have found is there was a disconnect between the political appointees at the top of the organization and the vast majority of employees in the organization who are all career civil servants in this general schedule. So, what Congress tried to do in the Civil Service Reform Act is to peel off the top three levels of the general schedule and take those positions that were known as GS 16, 17, and 18 positions, the top three levels in the career civil service, pull them out of the civil service and put them into their own categorization called the senior executive service. Now, the benefit here for people who were put into the senior executive service is that they would be eligible for bonus pay from Congress. So if their agencies overperformed and met their goals and objectives, they would be in line for bonus pay. And secondly, it also gave them a lot more flexibility in moving between agencies and departments. So they weren't just locked into one agency or department. So those are the advantages for joining the senior executive service. The disadvantage was that you lost your career civil service protections. So it made it easier to dismiss you than it was to dismiss a member of the career civil service. Also, that bonus pay that was promised by Congress never materialized. And so Congress, year after year, would say, we just don't have the money to provide you with this bonus pay because we're running deficits year after year after year. So what that created is a lot of upset, dissatisfied, and disaffected members of the senior executive service. But what the senior executive service is meant to do is, again, to bridge that gap between political appointees and the remainder of the general schedule career civil servants. So today, the general schedule runs from a GS1 up to GS15. All those GS 16, 17, and 18 positions that used to be part of the general schedule, they are now part of the senior executive service. And the senior executive service is now comprised of five levels known as ES levels. So ES1 through ES5. And that's your senior executive service. If you're in the federal bureaucracy and you want to become a member of the Senior Executive Service, there is now an Executive Service Training Academy. So anyone who is in a GS 13, 14, or 15 position, they can apply to attend the Executive Service Academy. Once completion is done of the Executive Service Academy, that then makes them eligible to then become part of the Senior Executive Service if they wish. So all these things, OPM, Merit System Protection Board, Office of Special Counsel, Federal Labor Relations Authority, Senior Executive Service, all those things are still with us today, and they still provide the basis of this civil service system. However, as I said, our current system is a hybrid system where our agencies are headed up by these political appointees. Below them are senior executive service members that kind of exist in this netherworld between being a political appointee and being a career civil servant. So they're kind of a hybrid type of position. And then the remainder of our members of agencies and departments, our bureaucrats, are members of the career civil service in the general schedule. Coming out of an MPA program, if you want to join the federal bureaucracy, it really depends upon what agency or department you join. It also depends on if you can get hired. We've had over almost a quarter million civil servants that have been removed from their positions. And so I don't know how much hiring there really is going on outside of DHS and ICE. But if you do join the federal bureaucracy with an MPA, and if you have, 3 to 5 years of experience, you're probably going to go into the general schedule somewhere around a GS 11, GS 12 type of a position. And that's probably where you will end up entering. Even though the general schedule technically runs all the way down to GS1, there really aren't GS1 and 2 positions. It really starts about GS level 3. GS level 3s are basically student interns, temporary student workers. They're at the GS3 level, and then it goes up from there. So that's kind of a quick overview of our current system of civil service, at least at the federal level. We know that our approach to managing these employees is really much more of a human resource management approach as opposed to human relations or classic organization theory. And we talked about all that when we talked about these theoretical perspectives to public administration. Most of our agencies now take more of a theory Y as opposed to a theory X view to managing their employees as human resources as opposed to managing them as personnel. So that provides us kind of with a basis for understanding what career civil service is and how we hire people as public administrators to work in the bureaucracy. What you will cover in PPA 577 is then how you manage these employees as human resources. So when you get into 577, you will talk about the functions of human resource management. You'll talk about things such as recruitment and staffing. You'll talk about things such as allocation of work. You'll talk about things such as training and development, discipline and sanctioning. Those are all the basic functions of human resource management. Those are the functions that we will foreshadow in the first half of class next week. And then we'll also talk in the first half of class next week about collective bargaining, how collective bargaining works today, and some of the ways in which we can mitigate some of the problems we run into whenever we have a collective bargaining process and disagreements between management and employees. So we'll really get into some of the granular details in terms of how we undertake this human resource management process with our career civil servants. We will do that in the first half of class next week. Then the second half of class next week, we will talk about our final topic, which is the management of fiscal resources. And that's when we'll then get into some of that information you'll be covering in PPA 555 public budgeting. So that gives us kind of a jumping off point for what we're going to be covering then in our last Zoom session next Wednesday. Any questions or any clarifications on any of this information that we have covered tonight? I know it's kind of been a lot of information we cover, from policy analysis to program evaluation to effectiveness to the foundations of career civil service. Any questions or any clarifications necessary on any of that information? I did have a breakout room exercise that I was going to do at this point in time, but we're pushing up against 9 o'clock. I don't want to try my luck with my internet connection. So far, it's been good. I've gotten a couple of unstable messages, but for the most part, it's been good. I don't want to push my luck with that. So I think we'll call it quits here tonight with this. And then again, pick up next week with human resource management and the management of fiscal resources to round out all the information we typically cover in PPA 500. As a reminder, next Wednesday, you have your final Canvas essay drawing upon this information we talked about with policy analysis. And then on Saturday, the 21st, hopefully we'll get through everything on next Wednesday. We won't have to have class on that Saturday. You'll just have that time to finish up your final assessment. If you have not completed your midterm assessment yet, please do get that turned in by midnight. I'll get those graded and turned back around to you sometime tomorrow, provided that I still have internet by tomorrow morning. Okay? I'll have this recording up on our campus site no later than tomorrow morning. Again, provided my internet holds out nicely. Any questions as you start thinking about this final assessment, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, we'll be back at it for our sixth and final Wednesday session next Wednesday at 6 o'clock. Have a great week, everyone. Hope you enjoy the rest of your week and talk to you again next Wednesday. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.